Performance Committee meeting will now come to order. We are convened as of 8:32 a.m. I'd respectfully ask everyone attending this meeting to please mute yourself unless you are recognized to speak. Thank you for joining. Please note that this committee is being held remotely via Zoom and will be audio and video recorded. The meeting recordings, along with unofficial minutes of this meeting, as well as other meetings, will be posted as soon as practicable on the board's website at rtd-denver.com, and a live stream of this meeting is also available via the RTD YouTube page. Directors and members of staff, for the sake of the record, if you would like to be acknowledged during this morning's proceedings, please raise your virtual hand and wait for me to call upon you before speaking. Directors and staff participating by phone can raise their virtual hands and indicate they'd like to speak by pressing *9 and toggle the mute settings with *6. Before calling the roll, I will note that Director Deschel has resigned from this committee. That has nothing to do with the work of this committee or anything going on with this committee or with RTD. This is due to personal conflicts that he has in his schedule and some overcommitments. So we're certainly sorry to lose Director Deschel from this committee, but for the foreseeable future, the committee will be comprised of its remaining 6 committee members. I will now go ahead and call the roll. Director Busick.
Here.
Director Catlin.
Here.
Director Geisinger.
Here.
Director Guzman messaged me that he'll be joining us shortly. I'll note when he joins. Director Sloan.
Here.
And I am here. This is Director Davidson. That's 5 committee members present, 1 absent, although we are expecting that member to join, and we'll note for the sake of the record. For the sake of the record, I did see that Director Rosenthal joined earlier. I believe he is trying to find a way to dial in. He is not currently here, but I'll note that if he joins. Am I missing any other directors that have joined us today? All right, hearing none, we'll move on. We'll go to the public comment section. This is for anyone who would like to address this committee regarding any topic in the published meeting agenda for the current and for the immediately prior month. If you wish to speak and you have not already done so, you can raise your virtual hand or press *9 on the phone. I am not currently seeing anyone. Can I ask the board office if anybody has their hand raised?
There are no hands raised.
Okay, thank you. And I just received a message that Director Rosenthal is present. He is dialed in. Okay, so we will move on to the recommended action portion of the agenda. There is 1 recommended action. This is for the Community Value and Customer Excellence Surveys Contract Award. This is for the Board of Directors to authorize the General Manager and CEO or her designee to enter into a contract with ETC Institute for the provision of community and customer surveys. The contract is for 3 base years with 2 additional 1-year options exercisable at RTD's discretion. The total not to exceed cost for all 5 years would be $984,550. And I'd like to note before calling for a motion that Director Guzman has joined us. All 6 committee members are present. Thank you, Director Guzman. Do we have a motion for the recommended action?
So moved.
Director Catlin, the mover, a second?
Second, Guzman.
Director Busick. I think I saw Director Busick is the second. And then, yeah, so we'll go ahead, and I would like to ask Ms. Leah Riley, our Chief Administrative Officer, to please present this item.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the Performance Committee. Again, I'm Leah Riley, Chief Administrative Officer. As the chair already went over, this is for the board to authorize the General Manager and CEO to enter into a 3-year contract with 2 option years with ETC Institute to do our customer and community surveys. The responses to the community value and customer excellence surveys are going to be used to garner the agency's net promoter scores. They also will be used to garner community and customer attitudes, opinions, perceptions regarding metrics that are on the agency's quarterly scorecard. It's important to note that in the scope of work for this contract, there are items to ensure consistency in data collection and reporting, consistent with the surveys conducted in 2021 and 2022. Highlights of that are that the consultant will work with RTD to develop a survey method based on the current route line configuration and ridership, and developing a sampling procedure that ensures collection of a representative and statistically valid sample of RTD customers via intercepts on board at transit stops, stations, and aboard buses and trains. The consultant is also going to survey a pool of current paratransit customers who've used services within the past 6 months. And the consultant will develop a comprehensive report for all modes that clearly communicates findings and observations, similar to the key driver analysis we have received in the past. And lastly, the results are anticipated to be presented to the board no later than October 31st of this year. Thank you. That concludes my remarks.
Thank you very much, Ms. Riley. Questions or comments from committee members or any other directors present? Yes, Chair Geisinger, please.
Thank you. And thank you, Leah. That was real helpful. I guess I'm wondering, and I talked to Ms. Johnson a little bit about this, but does it make sense to do those surveys? I know this year we can't, it's already summer, sooner in the year, in the spring or something. It seems like it's important information that we get. We're trying to move this all forward and come up with a better way of doing reviews, but the NPS score and all of that are important in terms of, where the agency is. And so it seems to me like looking at moving that sooner would make sense. Has that been discussed? I see Ms. Johnson's hand up too.
Yeah, Ms. Johnson, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much, Mr. Chair and Chair Geisinger. Thank you for the question. One thing I wanted to qualify in reference to the conversation that Chair Geisinger and I had, when you look at transit ridership, it's generally seasonal, and it's intentional that we use the fall because that's when people are going back to school, which tends to have a higher level of transit usage. Recognizing that unlike most transit agencies, our fiscal year does not occur on a standard fiscal year schedule of July 1 to June 30th. That's why we're more or less at a disadvantage. But I would caution us from adjusting that because we have a greater opportunity and greater propensity to garner transit ridership data that would be useful to us overarchingly. I would say we could look at other aspects if we're trying to align this, say, with the GM CEO's performance or something of the like, that may be more beneficial than moving this holistically. And there's reports that support. There are reports that support what I'm saying relative to the period of time in which usually one garners information from transit ridership. Thank you.
So there's a difference between like April versus September?
Well, so a couple of things. There could be contingent upon what the school cycle is around here. So we would need to look to see like who's on a semester basis, who's on a quarter basis, but then we have to ensure that we align it in such a way. So I'm saying as we go forward for this year, I would not advise that, but we could look at that in outlying years.
Right. That's all I was asking. I realize
I misunderstood
right now.
I misunderstood that.
But it seems like this committee it would be helpful, at least for me, it would be helpful to see that sooner in the year since we have a late deadline. I also, I don't know how this cuts, but the survey will be right on the heels of our zero fare 2 months. And I don't know if that was discussed, if that changes, we'll hopefully have new riders. It may make a difference and it may not be representative of other months. Was that discussed?
It was discussed, Madam Chair, and this is no different from what we did last year going forward. And that's why we were intentional with doing multi-year so we could have consistency as Ms. Riley referenced in the course of her brief presentation.
Okay. And then I just was confused by one thing, and then I decided it might be a typo. In the report, it says, it's the paragraph starting with culminating from a competitive request. It says on November 2, 2022, the 2021 survey results were presented to the board. Should that be 2022 survey results? I think we've gotten the 2021 results earlier.
Mr. Chair, if I may,
Yeah, Ms. Riley, please go ahead.
I do believe that is a typo. In November of 2022, you all would have received the 2022 survey results. So my apologies for that error.
No problem. We'll just change that separately from the motion, I assume.
Yes, I think I'm looking at the recommended action can remain the same. So for the sake of the record, we'll just correct the typo in the report. So no need to change the recommended action in the motion at hand. Yeah, thank you for noting that, Chair Geisinger. And I'm sorry, just a quick clarification on that question, just to round that out. Ms. Johnson, when you were mentioning we could look at adjusting the time, so in future years, the downside of that would be the quality of the feedback. There's data to suggest is best at this time of year. Also, you noted an important piece, which is the consistency of the data, but you made reference to how this aligns with your performance review and that adjustments could be made. Were you suggesting that we might make adjustments to the timing of your performance review? I just wondered if you wouldn't mind clarifying that comment.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. So let me go back. Chair Geisinger did say, what about April? There's some trepidation with April because that's spring, and oftentimes there could be spring breaks and other holidays that are factored in. Through my experience in looking at September, that's traditionally after the summer months. And so basically we would have consistency going forward with what we're doing in comparison, right? For consistency's sake. I did reference that perhaps going forward, there could be an evaluation. When I say evaluation, I mean assessing what might be optimal. And we could potentially look at finding, an ideal time in which to do that. And then I also did reference that if we're using this for the benefit of the general manager CEO evaluation, whether it's me or somebody else in the future, I said there could be some adjustments made with that, recognizing this organization adheres to a calendar year versus a traditional fiscal year, which I think hampers what we're able to do going forward. So I'm amenable to all of that, but I wanted to qualify and clarify that for this year coming forward, it would be difficult for us to make that adjustment, recognizing what we have before us. And we put this out with the intent that it would be done in September, which would probably yield us the best results. Thank you.
Got it. Thank you for the additional clarity on that. And thank you, Chair Geisinger, for the question. Thank you, Ms. Johnson. Director Catlin, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I recall on the last survey that the statement was made that all routes were surveyed and that we had coverage, and I took exception to that because the very few routes that are in my area were not necessarily covered. I know that there is some dissatisfaction, or there are some viewpoints from some of my constituents that I think would like to be expressed. And I just wanted to make sure we had some coverage in this area, in the area where routes have been dropped or coverage is not as good as in other parts of the community. So I don't know, Ms. Riley, if you're going to be managing this contract or monitoring it, but I just wanted to make sure we had coverage. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, if I can respond. Thank you.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Director Catlin. It was a requirement of the survey last year for all routes to be covered. So BBC did report to us that they did cover all routes within the district. That was in the presentation results that went to the board last year. In addition, the scope of work this year does require that all routes are covered within the survey as well. So you can expect that moving forward.
Thank you, Ms. Riley. Thank you, Director Catlin. Ms. Johnson.
Yes, just further to the point that was raised by Committee Member Catlin and then Ms. Riley, recognizing that there could have been some discontinuance of routes in Director Catlin's service area, we can ensure that that's covered through the community survey, because questions are posed relative to why somebody would not utilize RTD services. So I think that's the intent when we do a community as well as a customer survey. We garner that information from those groups, and then that can be compiled holistically as we go forward. So the voice should be heard, whether we have a route established or if we don't, from the community aspect of the survey.
Thank you, Ms. Jensen. That's helpful.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much. Any other questions, comments? Yeah, Director Geisinger, please. Chair Geisinger.
Just one quick question. This covers community value and customer excellence. Are the surveys for employee ownership and has that one already been done? Am I thinking about that? Yeah. And then there's a finance piece. Those are done. Is that a survey that's done separately? Can you just give me an update on those, please? So I can refresh my memory.
So Madam Chair, if I may, and then I'll yield the floor to Ms. Riley. Just Wednesday during the course of our board meeting, I shared with you or with all of the board members that we had just leveraged the employee survey that was done for a period of 4 weeks that commenced the last 2 weeks in April, and that was finished on May 12th. It's intentional in reference to timing, recognizing that 2/3 of our workforce represented employees. So we basically ensure that that's in alignment with when people do their picks in reference to their shifts, so we can garner as much participation as we possibly can. This year, we were able to get 47% of our workforce that participated. Staff is currently assessing those, so that is done internally because we leverage our employee ownership task force and our employee ownership solution groups, i.e. employees, to go out and coordinate with their colleagues. And so as relates to, you're talking about finance, there's different mechanisms, and I see Mr. McLeod, who is on the call, he could better address that as we talk about our path forward relative to any type of information that we garner for our strategic priorities relative to financial success. Mr. McLeod?
Thank you, Deborah. Good morning. Yes, and most of the data that we pull for our strategic plan regarding the financial success comes from our month-end closes. So that information is generally basically restating some of the information that's provided in the monthly financial statements. There are some other sources as well, but that's basically, it's very objective. It's all numbers driven for the most part. So I think that kind of sums it up high level.
What about the half? It's 50%, success and 50 objective and 50% whether people, I think it was whether people think that RTD is spending its money well or something like that. And how do we assess that?
Thank you, Chair Geisinger. Yes, and that is true. So that will come from survey questions and the perception of how their tax dollars are invested and spent. What we're doing from a tactical side on that end is really trying to provide more information and also with the update of the RTD website, there will be a redo essentially of the financial page as well that communicates that out to provide that information.
So the survey is part of these other surveys?
Correct, yes.
Okay, thanks. That's what I was wondering. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for that clarity. Appreciate it. Chair Geisinger, does that answer
All
your
done.
follow-ups? Great. Any other questions, comments? Thank you for the discussion, and I appreciate, I know we've had the chance to discuss the scope of work in the past, and thank you for bringing this forward. I'll go ahead and call for the vote. I'll do this with asking if there are any no votes on this recommended action. Great. Seeing no votes, that's 6 aye votes, 0 no votes, 0 abstentions, the motion will pass. Thank you very much. We're going to move on from recommended actions. Thank you, Ms. Riley, for presenting that and being available for questions, as well as Mr. McLeod. We're going to move into the discussion items. We have one discussion item. This is with regards to the compensation philosophy for the 2023 General Manager and CEO. First of all, before opening it up, I'd also like to thank our Chief People Officer, Charlene Pelleggi, for offering up this presentation. As a reminder to committee members, we've discussed the need to implement a compensation philosophy for the general manager and CEO that we can anchor to as we review the compensation analysis that was performed by Gallagher, and as we discuss our go-forward plan from here with evaluation. So with that, in addition to thanking, I'd like to open the floor to Charlene Pelleggi, our Chief People Officer, to please go ahead and present this item.
Chair Davidson, good morning, committee members. I'm going to share my screen and walk us through today a presentation on a compensation philosophy. Just give me a moment here to. Hopefully you're all seeing my presentation now.
Yes, looks great.
Perfect. Wonderful. So today I just want to take a little bit of time. I've been invited to come and provide an overview of a compensation philosophy, effectively what it is, what it is not. So today we're going to cover things comprising a compensation philosophy, considerations, factors. We'll go over a few types of compensation philosophy, the components that are linked to a philosophy. As I said, we'll also just touch on what it is not. And then we'll take a look at where we are currently as an agency, identify some gaps, and I have a few recommended actions moving forward for discussion and consideration. So when we think of a compensation philosophy, I do want to be really clear before we move on. I know there's been in a prior meeting, we had a conversation. I want to state from the onset that this is about executive compensation. It is a compensation philosophy. This presentation is geared towards executive comp for the general manager and chief executive officer. It is not intended to convey that the board would be considering establishing the compensation philosophy for the agency as a whole, but the board is the governance and policy body that does have the purview for establishing a compensation philosophy for the senior executive of the agency, the GM and CEO. So starting off, what is a compensation philosophy? Well, simply put, and I'm not going to read this definition from the Society for Human Resources Management, but in the simplest of terms, it's a formal statement that guides, sets as a foundation, how an agency, in our case, or an organization would position their employee compensation. Essentially, if you establish the right executive compensation philosophy, it can act as a catalyst to organizational success. And establishing that on the outset, having a philosophy, helps guide decisions respective to a total rewards or compensation package. So what are the considerations that we would want to look at when developing a compensation philosophy? There are a multitude, but many of them fit within these 5 buckets. You'll see budget at all times, and I'll reference this a number of times as we go through this presentation. The ability to pay, the fiduciary responsibility, is primary and is key, and that is unique to every organization. Additionally, what is the industry in which the agency is, and in what industry would they be competing for talent? Additionally, you want to look internally at the values and goals of an organization. You would consider those in your compensation philosophy, as well as market. So who your competitors are, and again, as I said, where will you recruit talent, and what industries or what other comparators would be seeking to recruit our talent. So when we look at those considerations, we step into factors. These factors, of which there are 6, the whole goal with these factors are to attract and retain your talent. So when we're looking at that, we want to consider financial, which I've already spoke of, but you also want to consider your agency demographics. So the size of your organization, the size of the budget responsibility, the number of employees, the market in which your agency operates. You want to look at your industry, as we talked about before, the factor of is this industry, i.e. the transit industry, highly specialized, or could anyone come in and sit in a CEO and GM position? What are the strategic goals of the organization? Again, as I indicated, the right compensation philosophy for an executive can in fact be a catalyst to, when done well, can be a catalyst to organizational success. So you want to take in those strategic goals into consideration, and they become a factor when you're drafting and considering what your framework compensation philosophy would look like. You also consider talent. So as I indicated, some of these are, they're correlated, they're directly correlated. So while you're considering your industry with respect to the transit industry and its complexities, you also would be considering the talent and where would you seek that talent? And as I said previously, where would that talent potentially be poached by? What level of skill does that talent need to bring? Is in order to be successful in your organization, and I'm speaking broadly at a high level of a compensation philosophy, can you have a low skilled, if you will, or little experience individual come in and lead your organization? The example that I gave Director Davidson when we were talking about this, take a chief people officer role, for example. Chief people officer and a chief financial officer, frankly, those two positions are deemed to be not necessarily industry specific. They can move from one industry to another. GM and CEOs and a few other more highly skilled or specifically focused positions, not necessarily. So you want to take that into consideration when you're looking for your talent. Again, the intention is to attract and retain talent. You also want to look at your competitors. Again, when we get into future slides and we're considering market, who are you comparing yourselves to? Are you only comparing to other public agencies? Are you comparing only to transit agencies, or are you also considering the private sector? Again, all of these tie one into the other, because when I was previously talking about talent, if you believe that your talent would only be sourced from the transit industry, then you may only likely consider transit industry as your competitors. But if you believe that your talent could be sourced and or poached outside of transit agency into another public agency, for example, then you would also need to consider them potentially as a competitor. Additionally, these factors, when you're considering them, you're always looking for your compensation philosophy to not only attract and retain, but also to be equitable and fair. So here I want to talk about, I've provided for you 4 different compensation philosophy types. But before I get into those, I also want to touch on lagging, leading, and match indicators. When you're considering a leading indicator essentially values the employee above all others. So at all times, you're considering the employee and your ability to retain and or attract that talent. Often you will see this when there is a very high labor demand and you're having difficulty attracting talent. Again, the focus will become on that talent because you are in such a highly competitive market. Conversely, if you look at lagging values financial stewardship above all others. So above all other factors, in a lagging compensation philosophy, or when we get to components of compensation, of a compensation philosophy and your compensation pay, lagging is about financial responsibility and stewardship. And lagging is often used and is successful when you have low labor demand and or you have no issues or challenges attracting talent. Again, I point those 2 things out because the compensation philosophy is really designed to attract and retain talent. Then you have match, and match is a bit of both. Ultimately, you're matching market. So when you've identified your comparators, you, if a compensation philosophy has the intention to be matched, you're never saying we're going to be leading, we're never going to put the employee first, but you're also not saying we're going to be lagging and we're only going to be considering financial. What we'll find when we go through in future slides is that often you will have a mix. It's not uncommon to have a mix of leading, lagging, and match. What the challenge is to ensure that that you're leading in the areas that are going to retain and attract, and that you're lagging in the areas where the impact on the value that is provided to that is less impactful. Pardon me. So there's four types here, and we'll talk about each of these individually, but they are fixed, market, outcome, and flexible. So when we look at a fixed compensation philosophy essentially sets an employee, in this case, the GM and CEO as the senior executive, at a set rate of pay based on experience. Often a fixed compensation philosophy is not merit-based, it is not pushing for performance, it is truly just designed based on experience. If a executive has X years of experience, that equals a designated rate of pay. So I've got, when I consider pros to a fixed market strategy philosophy, there's ease of administration. It's typically very well thought out, it's quite transparent, and as I said, if you have X years of experience, you make Y dollars. The cons associated with fixed, they typically lag the market. They're often almost never a leading. They can be demotivating for that very reason. As I said, you want to have, often there is a mix, but if you're paying attention to your current market as we have today, where the war for talent is fierce, is the word that you heard me use before, this would often be a demotivating type of compensation philosophy. And often they don't engender the sense of employee ownership, really because it's based on experience and not necessarily performance. For an individual, if an individual is in a fixed compensation philosophy structure, it really doesn't matter how much effort and how much success they achieve. Their rate of compensation and the general mix of their compensation, total compensation will go unchanged. So if we look at market, I would suspect that many of us are relatively familiar with a market-based compensation philosophy. Essentially, it is compensation and a philosophy that is set to similar organizations for similar roles. So in this instance, for a GM and CEO, you would look at your comparators, who you've identified as your comparators, and then you would set your compensation philosophy to be on par and to match. The pros with a market-based philosophy is it's generally highly competitive. It can often be very motivating because it is based on, there is some ability, you can see as the market increases, compensation potentially increases as well. It eliminates subjective judgment, because if you're saying we have a market-based compensation philosophy and we are going to be, as an example, what we would say in comp P50 or median to the market, as the market shifts, so does the compensation in this philosophy would shift. It depersonalizes compensation. So it's not about the person, it is purely about the market in which the agency is operating and competing for talent. If we look at a con to this is that it does require regular market monitoring and adjustments. Often when a compensation philosophy is set as a market-based, and I said it's P50, if you don't adjust as the market adjusts, you will become lagging. If you were hoping to be matched and you don't adjust, you will soon become lagging. So it does require some ongoing administration and monitoring and a willingness to adjust with the market. As I previously said, it doesn't account for individual contributions. Again, this is simply tied to market. Fix is tied to experience of the employee. Market is tied to the experience of your competitors and what the market going market rate is. Additionally, one other con, there is a potential risk, as I said, that the ability to pay. And so if the market were to increase exponentially, an organization, an agency such as ourselves may find ourselves unable to maintain our place in the market that we initially, our compensation philosophy intended us to. So next we'll look at outcome. So outcome is, outcome's a mix. So outcome philosophy, a compensation philosophy would be based on market and an organization's business goals. So all of the pros that we talked about with respect to the market exist for this outcome-based. The difference is that this includes performance of the individual. It's not just based on market. So again, you can add, and one would typically see in an outcome-based compensation philosophy, additional components of compensation. And we'll go over the components in a few slides. But this is a marrying of the market and organizational outcomes. And so when those outcomes are achieved, there is often then some form of incentive type pay that is associated with a compensation philosophy of this type. The cons to this type are exactly the same. And except for the one I would say is it can be demotivating if the goals, the actual metrics are not effectively established. So i.e. if it's based on performance and the performance metrics were set so as to be unachievable, it potentially then would be, it could be demotivating because this is a mix. It's got market and performance. And so if the employee is truly unable to meet the expectations, then that whole part of the compensation philosophy is essentially not worth the paper in which it's written on because it's never attainable. The next one is flexible, or what sometimes is referred to as non-specific. So in a flexible compensation philosophy, this considers a variety of factors, so both subjective and objective. It includes the market. It also includes organizational goals and sometimes culture or values. So this is a more holistic approach to a compensation philosophy. All of the pros here are, it is competitive. It can be highly motivating. It again depersonalizes compensation. It includes objective and subjective factors. And I do want to say, even though it's flexible, flexibility does not equal vague. So you still need to be specific in your compensation philosophy. And then further from that, as you're building out your compensation program that aligns to that philosophy, you do not want to be vague in your intentions. So while there are objective and subjective measures, you want to have real specificity and clarity again, so as to be motivating and attractive. Because I've said it earlier, I'll probably say it a couple more times. A compensation philosophy for the GM and CEO would be to retain an existing GM and CEO, but also to attract and recruit, a future general manager and chief executive officer. Cons of this, similar to market, you need to constantly be looking at market. You need to be able to make adjustments, and you have to be cautious of your ability to pay. Anytime you attach yourself to market, that's always a risk that you have. However, I will say I think the majority of compensation philosophies have some form of a market component to them. And so any agency such as RTD would not be alone in its ability to have to be monitoring market. So as I mentioned, there are a multitude of components that would comprise a total compensation or total rewards. There's base pay. So if I'm tying us back to the fixed compensation philosophy, generally speaking, base pay would be the most significant driver. Again, years of experience equals X dollars. There's also health and wellness benefits, fringe benefits. So for us here at RTD, things like free transit would be considered a fringe benefit. Accident, disability, and life insurance, paid leaves. So PTO or any other approved paid leaves are also a component of total compensation that should align and serve to attract and retain your talent. Pension, short-term incentives, so short-term incentive plans, or a long-term incentive, so LTI, also could be. Now, short-term and long-term may necessarily, you would not see those in a mixed-based compensation philosophy. You would typically see those in an outcome and or flexible for sure. And sometimes you could in market, although that becomes a little bit more challenging to apply them there. Perks, there are other related perks that come that you would put. I want to highlight that compensation is a mix of intrinsic and extrinsic components. So there's what you can see and touch and the money that makes it into your bank account. And then there are the extrinsic components, which are manners in which you are engaged, things that you are permitted to do as the senior executive, things you are not permitted to do. And then I included here stock options. This would be for publicly traded entities, certainly would not be applicable to RTD, but I included it here just to illustrate that you need to look at your industry. You need to look at, it wouldn't make sense for us here, but clearly it would be unusual, extremely unusual in a publicly traded entity for an senior executive like the GM and CEO to not have stock options. That would almost be routine in an offering. So again, it depends on your industry, where you're competing for talent, and your mix, your type of compensation philosophy will impact which of these components and to what degree and how you would apply this mix of components. So let's talk about what it is not. So I think I did mention earlier, but I do want to reiterate again, this compensation philosophy that the board would ultimately establish for its senior executive officer would be for the senior executive officer. It would not be for the entire agency. However, this compensation philosophy that the board may eventually establish could have a potential to influence, or at a minimum should be considered by the agency broadly when we're setting the agency compensation philosophy that is under the purview of the general manager and CEO. Compensation philosophies are not static. If they remain static, you may have set yourself as being leading. You wanted to be leading, and in very short course, you could be lagging. So if you want to keep the intent of your compensation philosophy, it cannot be static and just, it's not a one and done. It is not a performance management program. Compensation philosophy has linkages, but it is not an assessment of performance. It is really the foundational document and framework under which you would establish your pay and the compensation components. It's not an all-encompassing list. It's not a boilerplate. You would not want to take even a compensation philosophy from another transit agency and just overlaying it over to RTE. Specifically because the circumstances where the agency is today as to where it needs to be in the future may very well be very different than what another transit agency is doing. So you need to make it specific to RTD. And then it's not retrospective. One of the risks sometimes in drafting a compensation philosophy is that we look backwards. And we often go, well, in 6 years ago, X happened. So we never want X to happen again. So we're going to draft this philosophy to make sure that doesn't happen. Compensation philosophies are forward-looking, retaining your existing talent or recruiting and attracting new talent. So they need to be moving forward. They need to be reflecting a forward lens and motion at all times. Just to summarize, so what is it? It must be legally compliant. We'll see that in one of the samples that I'm going to share shortly. It needs to be capable of attracting and retaining talent. You want it to be transparent. So transparent is to the agency as well as to the employee. It should be abundantly clear to an employee exactly what type of compensation philosophy, the components of compensation, and what needs to be accomplished in order to achieve said compensation. It needs to be fully transparent. And you want to review it regularly. So as an example, generally, if you're market-based, you should be looking at it annually. That doesn't necessarily mean that you make adjustments every year, but you definitely need to look at it annually so as to determine if you're comfortable, should you be shifting from a leading to a match or from a match to a lagging. So I indicated I'd share some samples with you, and I've got 4 here, and I'm not going to read them all in detail, as I understand you all have the package and you can take a look at them, but I felt it important to highlight and to demonstrate where what we've just been talking about, the considerations and some of the factors you can see in compensation philosophy. So for example, in the Community Action Partnership of Ramsey and Washington counties, they've made a very clear indication that their compensation philosophy and their program is directly linked to their mission and values. And they have that front center. It's the very first thing that they mention. They further go on to talk about that their goal is to attract, retain, and engage. So they want to attract, retain, and engage, but they also want to make sure that it fits with their mission, their values, and that it honors their commitment to diversity and inclusion and honoring social justice and equity. And when I said there's intrinsic and extrinsic, it's also clear here that for this agency, they want to attract, retain, and engage, but they also signal a number of intrinsic rewards. So a positive work environment, career growth opportunities, successful work-life balance, and market competitive compensation and benefits. Now, this is clearly a compensation philosophy for an entire organization. It's not just for an executive officer. However, they're signaling to you what is important to them. My guess in reading this is they're going to be market competitive with other similar agencies. They're likely not going to be leading in compensation and other pieces. Where they're really going to focus their time is having a positive work environment. They're pushing their culture and a successful work-life balance. I think it's really important that they said successful. They didn't just say work-life balance. They said successful work-life balance. So I was able to find a compensation philosophy for BC Transit. So forgive my Canadian roots here, but as a prior student in Vancouver, I used BC Transit a lot. And what's interesting about BC Transit's compensation philosophy, they also are mission, vision, and goals oriented. That first statement really speaks to who they are as an agency, who they serve. And they put that front and center. And so with that, they also talk about what is their goal. It's an important tool to attract, motivate, and retain employees. But here they highlight with the requisite skills and the experience and commitment necessary to achieve the organization's strategic business goals. So contrary to our colleagues in the prior agency in Washington, here they're really talking about we want people who have the skills we need, the experience we need, and the commitment to help us achieve our goals. They also indicate that it needs to be competitive, fair, equitable, and performance-based total compensation. So this signals that there is some form of performance incentive and or base pay is commensurate, not with experience. So this is not a fixed compensation philosophy. This talks about performance. And so they're looking to reward people based on their performance and outcomes likely for the agency. I also want to highlight here, I just have it underlined. I indicated that we need to at all times consider your financial position, but you also have to consider in this case, in British Columbia, there's a British Columbia public sector and taxpayer accountability principles. Effectively, there's a program in the province that if you're in the public sector, that actually sets compensation levels and certain criteria in which you can or cannot provide benefits to. And so you need to be compliant with that. And so you would include that. Again, being transparent, that transparency, that employee should always know and be able to understand what may be governing the compensation, including external parties, in this case, government. So Stanford University, again, you're going to see similar themes here. So attract, retain, and reward, but this time they say high-performing employees. So again, it's specific to Stanford University. They're indicating that they're seeking high-performing employees and that they're going to reward them. Not just we want to attract and retain highly skilled and high-performing employees, but they specifically say they're going to reward them. And this would indicate that there is some form of incentive or performance-based, merit-based pay that at Stanford University they have in their compensation philosophy. They also indicate that it's tied to the attainment of individual, group results, and the achievement of organizational goals. This is another cue that there is some form of merit and or incentive-based pay, but they're also signaling something about their culture. This is not just about the individual and how the individual performs, but it's also how the organization performs and how the group. So they're really signaling what's important to them in their culture. Just in their compensation philosophy, you can learn a lot about an organization and what they value. The last one is the City of San Diego. I included this one because I found it really quite fascinating because it clearly states that, that they will pay at least the market median for comparably situated public employees. So they're indicating their market. They're also indicating who their competitors are, and they're saying for comparably situated public employees. They also go on to talk about that they have a goal to move towards market median for all classifications. I'm not going to go into all that detail, but what's key there is this is clearly a compensation philosophy that at one point I believe was lagging. And this is not uncommon in the public sector, given that they're having to compete not just with other public sectors, but talent is elsewhere. And so they once were lagging, often found themselves lagging. Now they're trying to catch up. They talk about their total compensation, that it should reflect their ability to recruit, retain, and engage. Again, they say highly qualified employees. And they talk about delivering world-class public service. So they're tying in their organizational objectives as well. And they also indicate that decisions need to be data-driven and that they're going to review it regularly, and that it should be reviewed periodically, again, to ensure that it continues to meet the goals of the city. So when I talked about it, looking at your industry, looking at your business as a whole, you want to look at it not just for market, but also, is it still serving the needs? Are you still able to attract and retain the talent? So I want to quickly take a look at what we have currently. So what I'm sharing with you here is for RTD employees as of 2023, and it's in our RTD employee handbook. Now, I believe I signaled earlier in a different meeting and maybe earlier today that we're looking at our compensation philosophy for the agency as a whole. And so for today, what we have is we indicate that we're going to be competitive with external labor markets, both public and private. So we're signaling where we're going to compete for talent. We say our comparators, we've identified those as other transit agencies and Denver Metro employers with similar business functions, and that who can be seen as direct competitors for labor. We talk about total compensation and that we want to be competitive at similar performance levels. We indicate we're going to look at the market. We're also going to look internally, and we want to reward results. So here we say individual pay decisions are based on individuals' results and their current salary range. There's also a note here of being affordable. So I mentioned a compensation philosophy should, and I say should, I might actually say must, consider its ability to pay and the organization's ability to pay. And then we make a general statement about our commitments to it being equitable and fair. So that's what we have for RTD's employees today. If we look at the general manager and CEO, at present, we don't have a formal compensation philosophy for our senior chief executive officer. The current general manager and CEO's contract refers to a compensation philosophy. At present, the general manager and CEO role does not have an established pay range. And our current GM and CEO is currently in the third year of a 5-year term. So today, a compensation for the GM and CEO or the senior executive would be seeking to retain. But as I've said before, any compensation philosophy should also be forward-looking, and it's to retain and potentially to attract. So I just want to touch on gaps. We've got just a couple more slides here. In considering how we're going to move forward, if the board's to move forward with establishing a compensation philosophy, you'd want to take into consideration what is the context? Where is RTD today? What does the environment look like? So I've put here just a few things. We have a new strategic plan. The agency is post-pandemic. So we're really focused on creating a welcoming transit environment. There's been a lot of change over the last few years. There's a lot of societal impacts. As the board is well aware, there's challenges facing the transit agency that have not been present before. We have people power. We are competing as best as possible for talent, but it is tough for everyone everywhere, and we're no exception. There's increased state and federal regulatory compliance, a highly regulated industry that continues to increase. It's not decreasing. An example of that would be the bipartisan infrastructure law and the complexities that just come along with an agency of this type and size. Increased government and community relations. The transit agency and our GM and CEO is expected and encouraged and desired to engage with government and community relations and increase the image, again, creating a welcoming transit environment. And then there's always present the continuing shift in a positive way, in my opinion, of the landscape with respect to diversity, accessibility, inclusion, and equity. These are reasons why I say you should never look back. It's never retrospective. It's where are we today? So in establishing a compensation philosophy, I would encourage the board to consider the current environment, the complexities, and then consider where would you get that talent? How would you keep that talent? What are the challenges before? Is this an organization that is in what I would call a babysitting state, or is this an organization that's in a transformation state? Also, organizations, if they're in a state of growth, you would want to consider all of those pieces, because that's going to directly drive where you source your talent and or how you retain your talent. So just to bring back to the Gallagher compensation study report, this was delivered to the board, I believe, November 18 of 2022. The board commissioned a compensation study for specifically the GM and CEO role. I thought it would be helpful just to highlight, based on this presentation, the outcome of that report. And so when we look at base pay, I've indicated here that it's a match The Gallagher report highlighted that they considered the base pay for the GM CEO as a match only as if one were to assume that the board adopted the recommended compensation range, the salary range, because the GM CEO base salary currently falls within the range, which was the recommended range, which was 280K to 490K. So I've just reiterated what Gallagher has said here for illustration purposes. Health and benefits for health benefits, specifically health and dental, are a match. Health benefits for vision were deemed in that study to be lagging. Pension was deemed to be a match. Paid leaves were lagging. Vehicle allowance, accidental death, and life insurance and severance pay were all deemed to be lagging components. Again, when you're looking at lagging, leading, or match, I do not want to infer that, as I said previously, an agency or an organization doesn't need to be leading in everything, nor do they need to be lagging, nor do they need to be a match. It needs to be specific to the agency itself and what it believes is required in order to attract and retain their key talent. So moving forward, next steps, I would propose that the board, the work of this committee, establish a compensation philosophy to attract and retain the talent of a GM and CEO, that philosophy, as we've discussed, should be aligned to the strategic plan. Culture should take in consideration the industry and the fiscal and people power responsibilities. I would recommend that the performance committee and the board adopt a pay range for the general manager and CEO, as was recommended through the Gallagher report that the board commissioned. That after the compensation philosophy is created, that it be implemented. And I say amend Ms. Johnson's contract to align where necessary. I have no idea whether there would be any need for any changes, because of course that's determined solely on the compensation and the work that the performance committee and ultimately the board would engage. And then after that, establish a GM and CEO performance and accountability plan that again would be aligned to that. So why I say that is if there were specific performance metrics that were being sought, and you may want to consider having a compensation philosophy that actually rewards performance. And so you would want to establish performance and accountability plan, including assessment targets and established criteria, of which I would recommend objective and subjective criteria often be in there, but to be as transparent as possible so that all parties ultimately are working towards the same goal. And when it comes time for assessment, there's clarity and understanding in target achievement. So Chair Davidson, that is my presentation. I'm happy to take any questions. I appreciate that was a lot of information, but I'm happy to answer any questions if I may.
And Ms. Pileggi, thank you very much. That was really helpful, really informative. I'll first open up the floor to any of my fellow committee members and or directors that may be on the line for any questions, comments, or initial thoughts regarding the presentation. So seeing none immediately, Ms. Pileggi, I'll jump into some of mine, and you and I. I'm going to go to go to my other colleagues. Chair Geisinger, please.
Right now, just a quick one. That was super, and it was a lot of information. Is there an article or something written that has some of that further background explaining all those pieces?
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, there's an article that I found this morning, believe it or not, published by Gallagher, the same agency that the board engaged to do the compensation study. There's actually I can send that out. I found that link this morning, actually, and it's really informative. It goes a lot deeper than I just did, but it's very informative.
Well, that would help me. I appreciate it. Thanks.
100%.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah, that'd be excellent to review. Director Catlin, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Ms. Pileggi, thank you for the presentation. I reviewed this over the weekend, and I thought it was interesting. So I am assuming that because we have not carved out a specific compensation philosophy for the GM CEO, that by default we use the agency philosophy as a guide.
My understanding is no, actually, that we're not utilizing the agency compensation philosophy, that they are seen as two separate entities for the
Okay,
senior executive.
I personally felt that the agency philosophy is pretty good. And my instinct or my thought would be that as we move forward to create a compensation philosophy for the GM CEO and looking forward, that we don't deviate too much from the agency, because I think it's a sensible approach, but that we look at that as a starting point and then maybe create some special carve-outs for the GM CEO. I just am fearful that if we deviate too much from the agency philosophy, that could create a real disparity with our employees. That's just my general thought.
One
May I
comment
respond?
I have in reaction to that and the question. Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah, go ahead
I just wanted for context, Director Catlin, absolutely, certainly can be something to use as a document, as a jumping off point. Two things. One, we're currently reviewing that compensation philosophy at the agency level. I'm waiting to finalize that review until the philosophy is set at the GM and CEO level, because best practice is that there should be some consistency. I called it cascading before. They're not the same. And I want to highlight that I get it, that the board establishes for the GM and CEO, but they should speak and align to one another. So your question around, can that be used as a reference? Absolutely. But there are some things in our compensation philosophy, in particular, where we're sourcing talent. It's not just Denver Metro. Like our comparators are a little bit different than they were before. There are some factors for us as an agency that we are looking at as well.
A perfect example. Thank you. I appreciate that. So it seems to me that it's iterative as you're reviewing the agency compensation. I mean, they're on parallel tracks, but they don't have to be identical. But anyway, I also appreciated the examples that you provided of the different agencies. And clearly there's a distinction between a social service agency, which was your first example, and something that is more performance-based. And I liked the example that pointed to the fiscal responsibility to the taxpayers. So there were bits and pieces of each of those philosophies that resonated with me, and I appreciated the examples because I think that it just gives a lot of food for thought. So thank you very much. Sorry, I didn't mean to get on my soapbox, but those were really helpful.
No, thanks. I appreciate the clarification. And I think the way that I hear that is there's an opportunity for this committee and then the board, by adopting, to have a discussion around what's important to us with the general manager and CEO. And then that may influence some of the cascading to follow with the revisiting. I just had a quick follow-up question. I'll call Dr. Busick on this thread. When was the last time that compensation philosophy for the agency that you brought up, Ms. Pelleggi, was modified or adjusted? Do you know the date?
I apologize, Chair Davidson. I'm not familiar. I'm not sure if GM Johnson is aware, but I don't know when that was last updated.
That's okay. So it's not recent. It's not under your purview. So yeah, Ms. Johnson, if you have any additional.
Yes, I would say when I was looking through something, the previous executive manager in the board office showed me something that was dated 2011. recognizing that I have an employment contract. It was not germane because there were tenants within my contract that didn't speak to that. And Director Kaplan made reference when we were negotiating my salary, I had asked that same question about a structure. Hence, that's why we're here today relative to my requesting of a compensation analysis that was just completed last year. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much. Appreciate that. Director Busick, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks, Ms. Pelleggi. It was a great presentation. So a couple of things. For example, the Stanford University one, I kind of like some of that, not just the leaders' performance, but also achieving organization goals. But the problem is that when you start expanding the definition of what's, part of that compensation philosophy, then you've got to measure all those things, and we have to measure those things as well. And I think that could be problematic. Just something to keep in mind as we move forward. And as I've said before in this committee, as I was not a fan of the community survey concept, and I think we had a perfect example of our last community survey that really was 180-degree different than what was really going on inside the agency. So as we move forward, I guess I think we probably need to focus first on whether we're going to lead or match, and then what type of philosophy we have, whether it's flexible or outcome based, and then from there I think build the components of the philosophy itself. Thanks. That's all I have.
Thanks, Director Busick. So one thought I had, and Ms. Pelleggi, I just wanted to get your reaction based on what you presented here, and I've had a chance to talk, but I like that there's some really good structure that we can anchor to, like the fixed versus market versus flexible versus performance. And I think we have to have kind of take the highest level first of, where are we going to fit in terms of that? And then drill down into, okay, how does that influence what we lead, what we lag, what we match? And is it fair to say that, after we kind of have that conversation, we would then be partnering with you, the board and HR would partner together to look at implementation of how we would get into the details of what we measure and so forth? Is that kind of the thought here?
Yes, as I certainly I'm here to avail myself for whatever support the board needs to move forward with this process. So absolutely. And just one piece, I've received word that the agency compensation, the one that I've shown here, is pre-pandemic and it's roughly 5 years old.
Okay, thank you. That's good to know. Yeah. So this is cool because this gives us a chance, and I love the idea that it's not retrospective. We're looking forward. We, can understand the environment that we're in and set a philosophy. So one thing that occurred to me, and I would just put out there, I think, first of all, I would say that this committee should target coming up with a compensation philosophy. I think what I would suggest is we discuss that at the following meeting and actually frame up some proposals that then we could adopt in July to bring forward to the board, since a lot will fall out of this decision. But there's interesting things we could talk about, like we could say, we want a flexible plan which combines market and performance. And this is where, again, Ms. Pelleggi, I like what you said about, the flexible doesn't mean vague. So I want to make sure that I'm being clear on this and see if this could fit. But let's say we were to say, okay, well, we're financial stewards of taxpayer dollars. So we want to match on, base pay. We want to match on benefits. And we want to be market competitive within our industry, within transit, or however we might want to frame that. But then we could say something like, well, we want to lead from a performance standpoint. So we want to have a performance component that has short-term incentive and long-term incentive, and we want to lead in that area. I can envision that being something that we discuss about how to implement it. And I think, Director Busick, you bring up a really good point about the surveys and, okay, how do we measure? What can we measure? One thing that occurs to me is we could say, well, if we believe that the net promoter score is something that we really want to be pursuing and would truly measure how we're viewed by the community, by our customers, and that's what's important, that could form the basis of a multi-year long-term incentive that could be quite attractive and quite market competitive. Whereas we could have short-term incentive components that could be related to the near-term annual or even quarterly objectives that we think would move the needle, which gives us a chance to kind of partner with the general manager. So I'm just throwing out some of the initial thoughts that were going through my mind as, looking at what could happen if we made those decisions of, well, we want to match as financial stewards on these aspects, but we want to have a component that leads. We'd have to figure out how to do that. So anyway, some food for thought, but I see some other hands going up. I'm first going to go to Director Sloan since you haven't had a chance yet. So go ahead, please.
Thank you, Chair, and great presentation. But I'm feeling a little overwhelmed on behalf of the Performance Committee right now, because it is June, and we had, a more limited task in mind when this committee began its charge, and compensation philosophy has long-term consequences that will require, a lot of upfront consideration. I was pleased to first hear, that staff was working on an agency compensation philosophy. And I thought, oh, good, we'll wait till that's done. And then we can work off of that. But now I understand, the cascading funneling effect that we should start with the CEO compensation. I would just like someone to explain why we need to complete the compensation philosophy this year before we begin the remainder of the performance committee's viewpoints. I understand we have experts here and I really appreciate it. So I would like to hear why it is so basic to this year's performance committee duties. Thank you.
Yeah, if I may, and then I'd like to see if Ms. Pelleggi, you have any further input on this, but I'm going to take a stab at what occurs to me, Director Sloan. It's a good question, but in the absence of one, so the general manager's contract refers to the compensation analysis. And we received that compensation analysis last year from Gallagher. And in the general manager's contract, we had, there's a point about making compensation adjustments. I may not be using the exact terminology from the contract, forgive me, related to that assessment. But in absence of a compensation philosophy, which is actually also referred to in the contract, we sort of don't know what to do with it. I think that chart that had where we're lagging, where we're matching, where we're leading, we haven't had a deliberate decision, a purposeful decision by the committee, of what we want to be leading on, what we want to be lagging on, and therefore we're sort of just defaulting. And I think that some of where we're tripping over some of our performance analysis, they somewhat go hand in hand, because if we say values are the most important thing or one of the critical important aspects of this from a subjective standpoint, that would inform our subjective analysis, our performance evaluation of our CEO and general manager. Likewise, if we say that there's going to be a performance component, we need to determine what that means. That means that sets apart a match from a lead or a lag to a match or something along those lines. And that makes it hard to set those metrics. So I think what we're realizing is we have this compensation analysis, we have a general manager's contract that refers to a compensation philosophy and that compensation analysis that was negotiated at the beginning of the agreement. And then we're finding ourselves without the basis for which to make that decision, which is a philosophy that this board says from a high level, not all down in the weeds, this is what's important to us. And then making that so simple, thoughtful, but so simple that we can revisit that on perhaps an annual basis, even to make sure that we're those values aligned. So that's one piece that occurs to me as to why this is important right now, is we have to react to that compensation analysis, and we're about to make decisions around improving the performance evaluation process. The second thing that dawns on me is that and I'll be careful how I say this, I think here, that we're in the third year of a 5-year general manager and CEO contract. So we're getting close to where we need to be talking about renewal, talking about recruitment. So recruitment and retention, I think, are really becoming urgent in terms of this board's retention or recruitment of a CEO and general manager. So filling in this gap. Also, I think this is an important time to do that in this present time. So that's my kind of initial thoughts on that. I want to see if Director Sloan, what feedback you have to that, and then open up to others that may want to provide some feedback there. So Director Sloan, how does that resonate?
I think it's really helpful. And I too am mindful that we are working off a present contract, that was carefully negotiated. And there might require, as Ms. Pelleggi said, amendments to that contract if we come up with some contradictory elements now. And that was part of what was underlying my question, that maybe it would be more appropriate to put everything in place for renegotiating the next contract rather than trying to piece it together now. But what I'm hearing from you is we really can't piece it together, until we have a compensation schedule. Is that an appropriate interpretation of what you've said?
Yes, it is. I think I'm getting an appreciation for, in the absence of that North Star, what we do with retention and renegotiation, what we do with any kind of new contract, we're sort of in the absence. And so even taking that compensation analysis, which I come back to that piece of the carefully negotiated contract you alluded to, one thing I'm looking at in that contract is we have a duty to react to that compensation analysis, but we don't have that North Star of, okay, what do we do with this leads, this lags? We could all decide to vote and say, well, we're happy with, where we are. Thanks, Gallagher. This is all perfect where we are, and let's adopt the range. But if we did that, we'd be defaulting into something without having, I think, the discussion of what was important to us. And Director Busick, I saw your hand come up as we were kind of talking through this, so I want to open the floor to you on this.
Yeah, thanks. And I guess I do agree with Director Sloan in terms of whether this is the right time to focus on this versus the performance metrics and analysis, because I thought in earlier discussions, we saw that as a huge issue for us to address this year. Although the GM CEO's contract refers to a compensation philosophy, it never existed at the inception of that contract or currently. It did refer to a compensation study, which would be performed, and it had. So I think, at least in my mind, we have what we need for this year, I believe, in terms of the compensation of our GM CEO. Obviously, a compensation philosophy is critically important. I'm just still not sure this is the time to address it if we think we have a lot to address on the performance metrics and analysis side. So that's it. Thanks.
Yeah, I can respect that, Director Busick. My proposal for the next meeting would actually be that we have an in-depth discussion on both, that we come the next meeting with the early ideas, the early discussion. I kind of view this as starting point for compensation philosophy. Now we have some time to digest that, discuss it, and select a compensation philosophy. Similarly, I would think at the next meeting, we should be talking about performance analysis. And I think these two kind of link together a little bit in terms of what's important to us. I also think that when we get together next time and we put performance analysis on the agenda, I have a couple of ideas about how to keep that really simple, how to make a simple adjustment. I certainly would welcome other ideas that folks would have, but identifying this as a gap, I think it's a good one for us to try to bite off. But having the 2 June meetings and a July meeting, I think there is time, if we push, to come up with a starting point compensation philosophy that doesn't have to be perfect if we can revisit it, and also to then discuss what we do from a performance evaluation standpoint. Ms. Pelleggi, please go ahead.
I just, if I may, I'm sorry, Director Catlin, I just saw your hand was up. My apologies. If I may, I just want to highlight just 2 things. So one, maybe 3. I appreciate the timing perspective. I do want to highlight that, and these are blending together. Director Davidson, or Chair Davidson, you answered the question very well. I just want to stress that respectfully, from a HR perspective, being involved, having been involved in numerous chief executive officer recruitments, it's an 18-month out. Typically, you want to know what you're doing. That's been my experience. It's not 6 months to the end of the contract. You're starting your conversation at about the 18-month mark as to whether an agency would be looking to consider renewal of an existing CEO and GM. So if you look at that from a timing perspective, in order to either retain or recruit, right? Understanding what that compensation philosophy is, understanding with transparency what would be rewarded, how would the agency seek to reward, would they want, what type of structure they're going to have, what's important to them. That's all critically important, certainly for attraction, but additionally for retention. And the last point I would just make, transparency. So respectfully, in my professional opinion, there is not as much transparency as one would like to see with respect to what exactly is deemed to be important to the agency, of critical importance. I.e., there isn't a pay range. There isn't an established pay range at this point. So how might the board determine what compensation would look like for a renewal, or if one was attracting? So my point here is to say it's not uncommon. It does require some lifting. It's not uncommon, though, for governing bodies to find themselves scrambling behind the ball because they thought they had more time, and before you know it, you start needing to recruit and you've run out of time. 18 months out, even 12 months out is going to come much quicker than we thought. So I just want to put that, like, from my perspective, to help guide a successful retention or attraction of a future GM and CEO. The work is best done sooner rather than later.
Yeah, thank you for adding that, Ms. Pelleggi. I would just note that we're coming to the end of the time that we had allotted for the meeting. And I know Director Guzman, you do need to drop. Thank you for communicating that. Other questions, other comments? So I'm sensing some pushback from the committee on this, but what I would propose is that at our second June meeting, we get together to discuss what's important to us from a compensation philosophy standpoint, that we read through the article that Ms. Pelleggi had suggested and offered, that we have some discussion around that. And I think that it would be appropriate to have, thank you very much, Director. So that we would have a discussion around the performance analysis or performance evaluation at that point as well. And I think those two go together. If that can be amenable to committee members, that's what I'd like to propose as our next agenda, is discuss the performance evaluation process as well as discuss the compensation philosophy and make some decisions. If that can work for everyone, I can work with staff, with our counsel Snyder and Ms. Pelleggi on some concepts we've put together for how to approach that discussion, given that there will be some sensitive matters discussed. So I know there's maybe some pushback on this, but I'm curious, directors that are remaining on the line, if you're okay with the idea of biting off this compensation philosophy and trying to get this done expeditiously. Decent thumbs up. Dr. Callan, you good? Cool. All right. So let's do it. So I'll work with board staff. I'll work with the general manager. Ms. Pelegi, thank you very, very much for the presentation. It's extremely informative, very, very helpful, and I think a huge service to this board, to this committee, to this agency. So thank you for that. I'll follow up with you as well as the general manager, as well as General Counsel Snyder and the committee and the board office to set the next agenda. With that, I'm going to move to other matters. Are there any other matters to discuss? All right, seeing none, our next meeting is June 26, 2023 at 8:30 a.m. Mountain Time. Seeing no further discussion, this committee meeting is adjourned as of 10:02 a.m. Mountain Daylight Time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.